Section 1 of The Man of Genius by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Part 1. The Characteristics of Genius. Chapter 1. History of the Problem. Aristotle, Plato, Democritus, Felix Planter, Pascal, Diderot. Modern writers on genius. It is a sad mission to cut through and destroy with the scissors of analysis the delicate and iridescent veils with which our proud mediocrity clothes itself. Very terrible is the religion of truth. The physiologist is not afraid to reduce love to a play of stamens and pistils, and thought to a molecular movement. Even genius, the one human power before which we may bow with the knee without shame, has been classed by not a few alienists as on the confines of criminality, one of the teratologic forms of the human mind, a variety of insanity. This impious profanation is not, however, altogether the work of doctors, nor is it the fruit of modern skepticism. The great Aristotle, once the father and still the friend of philosophers, observed that under the influence of congestion of the head, many persons become poets, prophets, and sibyls, and, like Marcus the Syracusan, are pretty good poets while they are maniacal, but when cured they can no longer write verse. And again, men illustrious in poetry, politics, and arts have often been melancholic and mad, like Ajax, or misanthropic, like Bellerophon. Even in modern times, such characters have been noted in Socrates, Empedocles, Plato, and in many others, especially poets. In the Phaedo, Plato affirms that delirium is by no means an evil, but on the contrary, when it comes by the gift of the gods, a very great benefit. In delirium, the prophetess of Delphi and Dodona performed 1,000 services for the citizens of Greece, while in cold blood they were of little use, or rather of none. It often happened that when the gods afflicted men with fatal epidemics, a sacred delirium took possession of some mortal and inspired him with a remedy for those misfortunes. Another kind of delirium, that inspired by the Muses, when a simple and pure soul is excited to glorify with poetry the deeds of heroes, serves for the instruction of future generations. Democritus was more explicit, and would not believe that there could be a good poet who was not out of his mind. Exuldit sanos helicon poetas Democritus. It was evidently the observation of these facts, wrongly interpreted, and according to a common habit, transformed into superstitions, which caused ancient nations to venerate the insane as beings inspired from on high. We possess not only the witness of history to this effect, but also that of the words Nevi and Mesogao in Hebrew, and Nigrata in Sanskrit, in which the ideas of insanity and prophecy are confused and assimilated. Felix Plater affirmed that he had known persons who, altogether, they excelled in certain arts, yet were mad, and betrayed their infirmity by a curious seeking for praise, and by strange and indecent acts. He had known in court an architect, a celebrated sculptor, and a distinguished musician who were mad. Pascal later on repeated that extreme intelligence was very near to extreme madness, and himself offered an example of it. Diderot wrote, "I conjecture that these men of sombre and melancholy temperament only owed that extraordinary and almost divine penetration which they possessed at intervals, and which led them to ideas, sometimes so mad and sometimes so sublime, to a periodical derangement of the organism. Then they believed themselves inspired, and were insane. Their attacks were preceded by a kind of brutish apathy, which they regarded as the natural condition of fallen man. Lifted out of this lethargy by the tumult within them, they imagined that it was a divinity which came down to visit and exercise them. Oh, how near are genius and madness! Those whom heaven has branded for evil or for good are more or less subject to these symptoms. They reveal them more or less frequently, more or less violently. Men imprison them and chain them, or raise statues to them." Many examples of men who were at once mad and highly intelligent were offered by Hecate in his Stiltiana, or Petite Bibliographie des Fonds de Valenciennes par un homme de démence, by Delapierre, an enthusiastic bibliophile, in his curious Histoire littéraire des Fours, 1860, by Forgues, in Revue de Paris, 1826, and by anonymous writer in Sketches of Bedlam, London, 1873. On the other hand, it was shown in Les Démons de Socrate, 1836, and Amulet di Pascal, 1846, in Verga's L'Epimania del Tasso, 1850, and Mayon Pazia di Cardano, 1856, that there are men of genius who have long been subject to hallucinations and even to monomania. Other proofs, the more precious because impartial, were supplied by Reviel Paris in his Physiologie et Hygiene des Hommes, livres aux travaux de l'esprit, 1856. Moreau de Tours, who delighted in the least verisimilar aspects of truth, in his solid monograph Psychologie morbide, 1859, and J. A. Schilling in his Psychiatrische Brief, 1863, endeavoured to show by researches that were very copious, although not very strict in method, that genius is always a neurosis, and often a true insanity. Hagen has more recently sought to prove a thesis which is partly the same in his Verwandtschaft des Genies mit im Irrsinn, Berlin, 1873, and indirectly Jürgen Mayer in his admirable monograph Genie und Talent from the Zeitschrift für Völkerpsychologie, 1879. These two writers have tried to explain the physiology of genius, and similarly they have reached conclusions which were reached more by intuition than through close observation by an Italian Jesuit, now quite forgotten, Bettinelli, in his book Del Entusiasmo nel bel arti, Milan, 1769. Reidstock in his Genie and Wahnsinn, Breslau, 1884, added little to the solution of the problem, as he merely copied for the most part from his predecessors, without profiting greatly by their work. Among recent writers I note Tarnowski and Tchukhinova, who, to the Russian translation of my book, St. Petersburg, 1885, have added many new documents from the history of Russian literature. Maxime Duchamp, who in his curious Souvenirs littéraires, 1887, has shown how many modern French writers have concealed within them the sorrowful spirit of insanity. Ramos Mejia, who in his Neurosis de les Hombres Célebres de la Historia Argentina, Buenos Aires, 1885, shows how clearly all the great men in the South American republics were inebriate, neurotic, or insane. A. Tibaldi, who in his book Regione el Pazia, Milan, 1884, brings fresh documents to the literature of insanity, and finally that acute thinker and brilliant writer Pisani Dozzi, who has given us a curious study, which is a monograph for madness in art. As in my Tre Tribuni, 1889, I have attempted to do with the insane and semi-insane in their relation to politics. End of section 1.